Hello and welcome everybody. I'm James Milan and this is Talk of the Town, and today we are with Jenny Raitt, who is Arlington's town planner, and we are going to be talking about zoning recodification. First of all, Jenny, thank you very much for taking the time. We always appreciate it. Can you give us basically, just start by giving us a kind of thumbnail description of how we got here? I know it's has to do with the master plan that was implemented a couple of years ago in town, but if you can just take us from that point to this point, it would be great.
Sure. Thank you for having me again. The master plan was adopted in 2015, and that's really the beginning of this process, whereby in the master plan, one of the elements, which was around land use, there was a recommendation. The first recommendation was to deal with recodifying the zoning bylaw. And that recommendation was from an audit document that's also in the master plan. Through that process, we identified that recodification was the most important issue in that particular element of the master plan, then formed the zoning recodification working group last summer. Is when they started working, and their primary task was to hire the consultant to actually do the recodification of the zoning bylaw. That they started back in the fall of 2016, and that brings us to this date. The path for moving forward is that we will finish the recodified zoning bylaw and then be able to advance to the more challenging and interesting policy issues that are outlined in the master plan.
But not possible without dealing with this first, it sounds like.
It's fundamental to deal with this particular issue, which is making sure that the document is readable, consistent with state law and policies of the town, and also something that people can more easily understand.
So I interrupted the flow of your your narration, but I would invite you to go ahead, and I'll try not to interrupt anymore.
No problem.
As you bring us up to date.
Yeah, so just to kind of go back to what the committee was formed to do, they were formed to secure the services of consultant and then to basically oversee the work of the zoning recodification process. And so the process was somewhat developed by the consultant in their proposal, where they recommended and prescribed a certain number of community meetings and outreach and engagement. But I would say that along the way, the working group has really played a pretty firm hand in guiding that process and saying they wanted more, or they wanted something to be different, or they would take it upon themselves to do additional outreach and engagement. So we've made it as robust a process as I think a group of 10 to 12 people can do at any one point in time. And I'm very happy actually with the amount of engagement that we've had to date, which has included, and we had, the first step actually was going back to the master plan, which included a zoning audit. The consultant at that time, in order to make that very fundamental recommendation that I referenced, they performed an audit of our zoning bylaw to communicate to the town, here's what's working with the zoning bylaw and here's what's not working with the zoning bylaw that you need to change. And they went through it section by section and subsection by subsection.
Okay, so in this particular case, when you use the term audit, what you're saying is they basically assessed, as you said,
yes,
the effectiveness of the existing zoning bylaw,
yes,
and kind of gave some guidelines that way for which areas you needed to concentrate on in terms of really updating or amending in some way.
Exactly, yeah, and that was communicated to the town in 2014, and then it's in the actual master plan document as one of the appendices. We took that as a starting point and went back to that document and asked them to, the new consultant, to take a look at that again and provide an update. And then we used that update as a way to inform some of the early interviews that we had with stakeholders in town. And we interviewed about 40 people who were identified as people who had either had a role in a development process, were realtors, were brokers, were people who are preservationists in town, people who are on the conservation side of things, people who are interested in the residential study group issues. A lot of different constituencies coming together to be interviewed by the consultant team. Then those two pieces together led to what we called an all-board meeting. This happened earlier this year. And the all boards meant that it was everybody from the ZBA, ARB, Conservation Commission, Historic Districts Commission, Historical Commission, the Board of Health, the Inspectional Services Department, Board of Selectmen, Town Manager's Office, pretty comprehensive group of people who came together on a Saturday and received the information about the audit, the update to the audit that I mentioned. Sort of had a report out from the summary of all of the interviews, and then had an opportunity to talk about their own challenges working with the zoning bylaw, things that they were interested in seeing changed or addressed through this process. Many of the things that came up at that point in time actually then helped to inform the first reading draft of the zoning bylaw, the new recodified bylaw. With some exceptions. And I would say throughout this point and up until this point in time, we've been slowly identifying a number of issues that are sort of policy matters that we didn't want to address through this process and never intended to address through this process. And those have been coming up since the beginning.
So those may have arisen either through the interviews you were having, through various mechanisms through which the public might have made their own views known, and also this meeting, this lengthy meeting, all board meeting that you were just referencing. Some certain number of things, basically, from if I understand you correctly, just are not the province or are not, doesn't make sense for you to address in this particular way, and they'll be addressed in a more appropriate, by more appropriate means, I assume.
Right, like for example, something that came up at the all boards meeting was, we really need a sort of, not expedited in terms of timeline, but expedited in terms of procedure of how we review development projects. How do we communicate between and among and across boards and departments and all these different players who have a review in a particular proposal? How do we make that more efficient and effective for people who are coming in as a proponent, and also to make sure that our communication is effective? Right now, a lot of that is actually codified in the zoning bylaw. And so something that we've tried to communicate from the beginning is we're removing a lot of that administrative, those requirements and the sort of submittal requirements and the process requirements from the zoning bylaw, so that we can address those things outside of the zoning bylaw with the different boards, and then as a staff, so that we can make things a more effective and efficient process regularly, and frankly fine tune it when we need to make things run more smoothly for everybody involved. But I would say that there were a couple of recommendations in relation to the administrative requirements that became more policy oriented that we were not going to handle at this time. Those are things that can be handled by each individual respective board at a later date.
And that makes me wonder about the zoning bylaw that is being amended or has been amended is 40 years old or approximately?
Yeah, like 40 years old.
And the document that eventually is going to be approved through this whole process, will it be I don't mean static in terms of the way that it applies, because it will be meant to apply to changing conditions, I'm sure. But will it be static in terms of it doesn't get amended in any official way over time until you take on a project like this? Or is a zoning bylaw in fact something that is constantly being added to or changed in some way without without addressing it in its entirety?
The zoning bylaw would be amended in the future, without a doubt. So we're just sort of refreshing and restarting in terms of what is the most fundamental zoning bylaw document.
Okay.
So the document that has been amended, and there's been many amendments over time. I don't have the final tally, but I will tell you at some point.
No, that's
I'll
fine.
report back.
I can just see how something could become quite unwieldy over a long period of time, or even internally inconsistent, because people addressing particular things might not look at how that fits into the entire context, et cetera. So I just
Yeah, and so and part of the challenge is that the zoning that was drafted in 1975, that's the original document. That was actually a full-scale zoning reform, not like what we're doing right now.
Okay.
They were changing all kinds of things at that point in time. It was dealing with policy as well as organization of the document. We're dealing predominantly with organizational issues with the document. Obviously, there are things that touch upon policy, but not the kinds of substantive policy issues that they were actually working to address at that point in time in '75. For example, high-rise development along Massachusetts Avenue. That was a conversation in the '70s. That's not something that we're working to address in this version of the zoning bylaw that we're moving to town meeting. But since 1975, with all of the amendments that have been made, the challenge is not the amendments that were made, it's where they were put in the zoning bylaw.
Okay.
And so that logic may have made sense at one point in time, like in 1986 when something was amended, may have made sense at the point in time. But all the subsequent later amendments have made the earlier amendments not make a lot of sense, or not have consistency, or not be carried throughout the document. So, for example, there might be, in a definition, there might actually be a rule or a requirement, instead of in the use section where you would actually communicate rules and requirements or dimensional standards. That is where you would communicate that. So that's a little bit of an inconsistency that we've been trying to identify and clean up and reorganize. And I think people will see the level of reorganization in terms of how you approach uses, how you approach what you can do in different districts, different type of districts, whether it's about height or open space requirements or setbacks. That's all been reorganized to frankly be able to communicate to people, if you're looking to develop a house, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do on these particular topical areas. And so to try to create a path that actually makes sense for somebody who's reading the zoning bylaw to be able to get an answer more quickly than have to go through and sort through multiple tables in a document and multiple sections of a document in order to find that answer, which is frankly the way that it is right now.
Well, that seems like a very compelling, but that does seem like a very compelling reason and a great outcome, for the town and for its residents, if in fact you are successful, and I'm sure you will be. Yeah. You had mentioned a little earlier that you had come up with a first draft, and I know right now, as we speak, you're about to come up with the final draft. How many drafts were there between that first one and the current final version?
Great question. So the first reading draft that we received, we brought it to a public forum in July. That was our first bigger public forum process. And at that point in time, actually, we were then working on a second reading draft. So the first reading draft sort of had the review of the committee, the working group rather, and then we had a new second reading draft. We went through the first meeting in July, the second meeting that we had in September, and then now we actually have the hearing draft. So there was really, I would say a lot of other iterations of things, but they weren't a full draft, where we've been receiving comments from lots of people through this special email address that we set up, just Zoning Recod, through the town's email address system. And also through various comments and feedback that we received at the public forums, comments that we received through town meeting members. We also conducted a survey, town meeting members to town meeting members, asking questions about what people understood about the process, what they wanted to see change, if they understood the changes that were being proposed, what would help them to understand the changes moving forward. And so we've had a lot of feedback, I would say, along the way that has now informed this most recent hearing draft, which is being released December 14th. And with that reading draft, we're going to have a companion document that is the same document, but in an updated form, which is a guide to the Arlington zoning recodification process. It'll be on the town website. It'll be at the counter in the Planning and Community Development office. It'll also be in the clerk's office, and it'll be at the library reference desk. And so that table will help people to understand and navigate the various changes that have been proposed that align with what the purpose of this project has always been.
Okay, so that is the document that people can refer to and access in
Yes.
order to be able to trace the changes. You know, there are word processing programs, for instance, in which you can track changes from one
Right.
draft to the next to the next. In this particular case, the decision is that this table or set of tables is a useful way or an effective way of doing the same thing?
That's our starting place. We think that by the time we get to town meeting, we may have additional information that will help to guide people about the changes. The most significant changes that have taken place are the ones that I was referencing a little bit ago about what you can and cannot do in different districts and making that an easier process. Those two newer sections have combined 3 to 4 different parts of the zoning bylaw across the entire zoning bylaw. And while it would be very interesting to see what a redlined version of that would look like, I'm not sure that that would help somebody to really understand how everything moved together or why everything moved together. But we will do everything we can to explain to people where things moved to and why they were moved to make more sense for people to understand it in the long run.
Yeah, so talking about that, explaining to people how it is that they can best understand the document and the changes and how it can impact them. I know that we are, as you mentioned, we are in mid-December as we speak, and we are looking at about 2 months from now, a special town meeting in which this is going to get its final approval, or be up for final approval. Preceding that, or I would just like you to go ahead and describe what the various steps are between now and then, including people's opportunities to weigh in with their own feedback.
So the first step is it'll be released, and we will be then having some open office hours in the Department of Planning and Community Development, where people who are, have a particular issue or an interest in understanding a little bit more deeply where something went to, what it means, they can come to the office and receive direct assistance from a staff person or staff people to really understand that. But there will be 4 public meetings that are framed as neighborhood meetings, very similar to the type of neighborhood meetings that we held during the master plan outreach process prior to town meeting that year. And that'll be more of an opportunity in a forum setting with town meeting members and other residents to learn a little bit more about the document, what it means, and what we're anticipating moving forward. And frankly, to also be able to communicate to people the types of policy issues that we've been hearing about that we are looking forward to working to address as the next stage of this process moves forward.
There is a perception in some quarters, and I do need to mention it, that it is a somewhat short timeline between the release of this last version or final version and the ultimate approval, given that this is a document that has existed for a lot of years and is intended to do so for years going forward. You've already described, and quite comprehensively, the process up till now. So it's clear that this is not out of the blue in any way. But I did want to give you an opportunity to address those kinds of concerns that people have raised about, is this happening too fast? Has there been enough transparency, because we all take great pride in the way that the town works in that way, et cetera. So just no specific question about that, but inviting you to comment in response to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it is not an accelerated process, and actually we are behind where we thought we would be. What I had been communicating, and the whole working group and the Arlington Redevelopment Board had been communicating from the get-go, was that we actually thought we would get this to a special town meeting this fall, which actually meant October. So we're now in a situation where we've been responsive to people wanting more time and wanting more opportunities for feedback. So I set up a number of open houses that took place in our department over the course of the fall to allow people to come in. I kept open the Zoning Raitt email address, which was quite well utilized by many people. People have been attending A or B meetings where the topic is raised as an item on the agenda. We've had a lot of feedback along the way, and have been responsive to the request for more time, the request for more input into what is in this final hearing draft. And I think that we've, at this point in time, been able to address a number of the things that have been raised, issues or corrections or things that were not caught in the drafting stages. And I feel very confident that the document is in a place where it is ready to be heard at a public hearing. And the public hearing takes place actually on January 8th. That's the start of the process. The neighborhood meetings follow that. Mm-hmm. And I do feel very confident that we have a document that's ready for a public hearing.
And what happens on January 8th? What you mentioned the public hearing, and that the document will be ready to be read and interpreted and analyzed, et cetera.
Yeah.
What actually happens in that situation? They're not going to read through the document clearly.
I mean, they'll treat it as a public hearing as they do with any other zoning or other public hearings that they hold. So it's an opportunity both to explain what it is that we will be talking about,
okay.
But it is mostly an opportunity for people to submit comments to the board, positive, negative, concerns, type. That's a good time to raise any other typographical or other types of issues that may not have been caught in the iterations that we've been looking at. So that's what would happen. And then they would close the public hearing, they would take a vote to move it to town meeting.
I understand. So the assumption there, of course, is that anybody who would be wanting to weigh in at that public meeting
Yes.
would have taken the opportunity between now or tomorrow and then to review the document at their leisure and to figure out whether they have something that they want to say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Now is the time to take a look at the document if it hasn't been done yet, which I understand. A lot has been going on for everybody all the time. We're all, it's a demanding process for staff and for all the volunteers who've been involved throughout the process. And we've all taken a considerable amount of time over the past year that I've mentioned doing this work and doing it on behalf of the town to make this a better document, to make it more accessible to everybody, to all users. And I have no doubt that somebody who's new in the process coming in would be entirely overwhelmed by it, because when I was at the starting point, I felt the same way, and I understand that. But I do think that if you're truly invested and interested and want to weigh in, you have to do the work of reading the document, or go to the section that most inspires and intrigues you, or impacts you, and then provide feedback on that particular part. Most of what people will see is that it is a reorganization of the zoning bylaw. That'll take some time to get comfortable with. Even people who really don't like the document know how to use the document. So all of that will take time, and yes, starting tomorrow, that's the time to begin that process. But even through the public hearing process, as well as the neighborhood meetings, we'll have plenty of opportunities to explain what's moved and where it moved to and why, and answer any questions along the way.
I feel like we have really covered a lot of ground, maybe some of the same ground over and over again. But I don't want to end our conversation without giving you an opportunity to address anything that you feel we haven't done and people should know.
So just to pick up on the people who are supportive of the process, I think, and or have concerns about the process, I am very interested in hearing from both groups of people, and I hope that, and I know that the Recodification Working Group and the Redevelopment Board hopes that those people actively participate both at the public hearing and then in the neighborhood meetings going forward. And of course, talk with their town meeting members who are going to have this on their table to discuss at special town meeting in February. But I'm looking forward to hearing about both sides and getting information from both sides about what's working, what's really effective, why they're excited about this process, why this is really interesting for ACMi to run, and and then what also, could change, what could we do differently? And are those things that we could do differently a deal breaker for the entire process, or are they things that we can address reasonably through the recodification process so that we can move on to the bigger issues?
Have you heard anything from town? You just mentioned town meeting members, of course, that people should reach out to those who represent them from their precinct, and that they will, of course, be voting on February 12th about this. Have you gotten any feedback from town meeting members about the process itself, and also this timeline of how long they have to be able to absorb the changes, to understand them, and to make an informed decision?
We have had feedback. We conducted the 3 town meeting members who serve on the recodification working group sent out a survey to all town meeting members, both electronically and then via mail. And of the responses that we received, which was a little over 50 responses, about 33 of them provided a very favorable opinion of where things were at, that they felt that they really acknowledged the work of the recodification working group and staff and the ARB, and that they were pleased with the process thus far. They had either participated in a public forum or looked at the document or the guide document specifically and felt that the materials were there. There were also people who said, it's too much information. They wanted less. They wanted like a 2-page FAQ or
some
summary,
kind of digest or something
that's easy to understand. So some people want more, some people want less. You know, we're trying to strike the balance between the two, but overarchingly, people were very supportive of the process and very excited to be able to move this forward.
All right, well, wanted to thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's been I would imagine a taxing conversation for you to just kind of have marshaled all of this information and be presenting it as well as you have. So we do appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. And thank you again for having me.
Good luck with the rest of the process.
Thank you.
For Talk of the Town, I'm James Milan with Jenny Raitt, and thanks for joining us.